Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Today we're tackling a book that I've wanted to talk about in depth for a very long time, Resurrection Day by Brendan DuBois. Resurrection Day is a Sidewise Award-winning novel published in 1999 that is part political thriller and part mystery, and is set after the Cuban Missile Crisis went hot. I myself read this book back when I was in high school, and I remember it being a great read, and it looks like that I'm not the only one who thinks that. Back in 2016, I wrote an article for Amazing Stories listing the top 10 alternate histories of all time, but because I haven't read every single alternate history, I tried to create an aggregated list that included other best of lists I found on the internet. In the end, Resurrection Day reached number 8, which is pretty good. So this is a pretty well-loved book, but is it a plausible alternate history? Well, let's find out. Major spoiler alert. Usually in these plausibility reviews, I try to avoid spoiling the plot and instead focus on the world building, but unfortunately the central mystery behind Resurrection Day is what the actual point of divergence was for this alternate timeline, so I will need to spoil that so I can talk about the world. I will try to keep what happens to the characters and other plot details under wraps, but you've been warned. Still with me? Good, let's begin. As mentioned before, the Resurrection Day is set in the aftermath of a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States after a diplomatic solution failed to be reached during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For those who don't know, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a confrontation during the Cold War that began when the Soviet Union tried to secretly install nuclear missiles in Cuba, but they were ultimately discovered by an American spy plane, leading to a tense 13-day standoff that almost ended in nuclear war that could have devastated the US, the USSR, Cuba, Europe, and China. In Resurrection Day, the worst-case scenario happens after an American spy plane is shot down on October 27th. Kennedy retaliates by ordering the bombing of Soviet missile sites on Cuba and later an invasion of the island as a whole. Things escalate when local Soviet commanders use tactical nukes on the invasion force, and after a desperate plea of peace from Kennedy is rejected, a general nuclear exchange begins on October 30th. At least that's the official story. More on that later. The Cuban War, as this alternate World War III is called, ends shortly after it began, when a General Ramsey Curtis of the Air Force negotiates a peace with the surviving Soviet leadership. In the grand scheme of things, the U.S. got off rather light. Washington, D.C., New York, Omaha, San Diego, Miami were all destroyed, along with several military bases and any towns near them. JFK, his family, most of his administration were also killed in the attack on D.C. The actual death toll was never given, but the number 10 million is thrown around in the book, which seems like a lot, until you realize that the Soviet Union lost 26 million people during World War II, so it could have been a lot worse. The Soviets, however, weren't so lucky. Almost every single one of their major cities was destroyed, along with many other military targets. The fallout from these attacks is so bad that it spread to the rest of Asia, causing disorder in places like India and China. By 1972, the former Soviet Union is described as the world's largest refugee camp, and appears to be de facto under control of the United Nations. This result is actually rather plausible. Despite JFK's claims about a missile gap when he was running for president, the United States was actually more prepared for a nuclear war in 1962 than the Soviets were. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States had 170 intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, versus the handful of ICBMs the Soviets had. Instead, the Soviets had to rely on short-range ballistic missiles, hence why it was important to put missiles in Cuba, but these tended to be unreliable and inaccurate. On top of that, America just had more nuclear weapons overall, with 27,000 nuclear warheads in their arsenal against the 3,600 the Soviets had. Finally, the U.S. led the Soviets in naval and air power, but the Soviets did have a larger army, but in a nuclear war, that wouldn't mean much. Anywho, the book takes place in 1972, 10 years after the war. There isn't a specific timeline given, but from reading the story, you get a general idea of how history was changed. Post-war United States is still recovering. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Secretary of the Treasury C. Douglas Dillon became president, and he was the only member of the line of succession that anyone could locate. Anarchy also reigned in much of America, especially near the blast zones, which were evacuated along with nearby towns and turned into restricted zones that no one but the military could enter. Things were especially bad in California, where anti-government militias rebelled, and the governor of California was executed by the military. Members of Kennedy's administration were rounded up and imprisoned. Ted Kennedy, a failed presidential candidate in our timeline, lives in exile in Ireland in this alternate timeline. Philadelphia is again the capital of the U.S., with George W. Romney as president in 1972, but there is an election about to happen with Nelson Rockefeller running for the Republicans and George McGovern running for the Democrats, with Rockefeller expected to win in a landslide since Americans blame JFK and the Democrats for starting a nuclear war. Despite elections still happening, it's pretty clear from the start that America is a de facto dictatorship. Martial law and rationing are still in place, the draft continues, the press is censored, there are labor camps for dissidents, and while General Curtis is officially retired, he still exerts extreme influence over over the military and the government. There is a group of special forces called the Z Force, which is utterly loyal to the general and handle all of his dirty work. There are, however, pockets of resistance. Bob Dylan, for example, still sings protest songs in Canada, and we could assume other artists found refuge overseas. Supporters of JFK also keep alive the conspiracy theory that he survived the attack on Washington and spray paint "He lives" wherever they can, while a good impersonator of JFK tries to rally the American people on a pirate radio. The restricted zones, or RZs, are also home to opponents of General Curtis. You see, not everyone was able to be evacuated in time before the government closed off the RZs. These people managed to make a life there by scavenging through the remains of the cities. Meanwhile, their populations even grew as dissidents from across America fled there. Life is tough in the RZs, but inside you're free to think or say what you want without having to worry about a visit from the Z Force. To be honest, I'm not sure why America is still in this state 10 years after the war. As I mentioned before, America's casualties only appeared to be half of what the Soviet Union suffered during World War II, and they survived that to become one of two superpowers and eventually got an atomic bomb and beat America in putting a man into space. Maybe you can make an argument that America isn't used to being attacked like other countries. For example, foreign troops haven't invaded the continental U.S. since the War of 1812, and were thus psychologically unable to recover fully and welcomed a dictator. But that seems somewhat of a stretch. But hey, I am an American, so maybe that's just my bias talking. I should take a moment and talk about General Curtis. It's pretty clear from the start that he's a fictionalized version of the real General Curtis LeMay, since their personalities and careers share a lot of similarities. Plus, they both had the name Curtis. In our timeline, LeMay was Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he argued for the bombing of Cuban missile sites rather than seek a diplomatic solution. He also thought the blockade was a bad idea and said Cuba should be invaded immediately. Unbeknownst to LeMay, Soviet commanders had been given the authority to launch nuclear missiles under their control should America attack. Thus, in hindsight, Kennedy made the right call at ignoring LeMay. To Ramsey Curtis's credit, he actually did some good in the Resurrection Day timeline. He championed the end of segregation and got a Civil Rights Act with some teeth passed a year earlier than it happened in our timeline. General Curtis even used the military to wipe out the KKK in the South. Meanwhile, his doppelganger in our timeline ran as the vice presidential candidate under George Wallace in 1968. Wallace, of course, was the racist governor of Alabama who once proclaimed segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and stood in front of the entrance of the University of Alabama in an attempt to stop the enrollment of black students. Great job, LeMay. You were really on the right side of history there. Despite his position on civil rights, General Ramsey Curtis was worse than LeMay in other ways. In the timeline of Resurrection Day, he actually ignored the president's orders, under the belief that it was better to fight the Soviets now rather than wait for them to become stronger. And he was the one who ordered the attacks on Cuban missile sites once the American spy plane was shot down, forcing Kennedy's hand. The result was a nuclear war that led to the death of millions, although Curtis was able to stop it before it spread to other countries. In the aftermath, General Curtis was able to paint himself as America's savior while portraying JFK and his advisors as fools who almost destroyed the country. Unfortunately, this meant Curtis had to cover up the real reason the Cuban War started. Records were destroyed, and anyone who knew the truth were either imprisoned, executed, or suffered unexplained accidents. You know, when I was reading Resurrection Day again, I kind of wondered why DuBois didn't just use the actual Curtis LeMay, but then I thought about it some more and was like, yeah, it's better to use a fictionalized version of somebody, especially if you're going to turn them into a murdering dictator. Anywho, back to the timeline. The United States has become a pariah state not only because of the deaths caused by the Cuban War, but also because the United States still has nuclear weapons. After the war, the rest of the world denounced nuclear weapons, with Britain and France dismantling their arsenals while the United Nations tracked down and dismantled the remaining nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union. The refusal of the United States to disarm got them kicked out of the UN, which now meets in Geneva, but they do have observer status by the time Resurrection Day takes place. The United States doesn't seem to care, as they have followed a policy of strict isolation, but they do remain close with Britain, who has been instrumental in providing aid to the country. Speaking of Britain, the nuclear war between the two superpowers turned out to be a blessing in disguise. They avoided being targeted at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, aka NATO, collapsed in the days before the bomb started falling. Thus, they were in a good position to not only help their battered ally, but also other members of the Commonwealth dealing with the aftermath of the war. By the present, the Commonwealth has transformed from a club of former British colonies into a political union with Britain in the lead of a reborn empire. Places like India, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are once again tied to London. The British also enjoy how the tables have been turned on America, but continued dependence on British aid has led to a growing resentment in many Americans. In all honesty, I don't find this reborn British Empire all that believable. First, I'm not confident that NATO would just collapse. Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister at the time of the crisis, was in close contact with Kennedy, and while he did advise the president to seek a diplomatic solution, he also kept British bombers armed with nuclear weapons on standby in case the worst happened. This doesn't sound like the actions of someone who was planning to sit this one out. Second, even if Britain tried to leave NATO before a nuclear war happened, that doesn't mean the Soviets wouldn't target Britain. We know the Soviets had plans to target NATO nations in case nuclear war broke out, and even if the alliance collapsed, I have my doubts that the Soviets would leave another nuclear power intact on their doorstep. Finally, even if Britain did avoid being attacked, that doesn't mean the empire would be reborn. We got to remember that 1962 Britain was nothing like the old British Empire. Britain came out of World War II weak and dependent financially on America. Unable to economically support its empire, Britain had no choice but to give its colonies independence. Additionally, after the debacle of the Suez Crisis of 1956, Britain's role as a major power was greatly diminished. All of this would still matter after America and the Soviet Union nuked each other, and Britain isn't just going to level up after getting their experience points. Sure, they could take a lead role in organizing other nations to deal with the catastrophe, but restart the empire? Probably not. But Britain isn't the only country on the way up since the Cuban War. Charles de Gaulle of France and Konrad Adenauer of a reunited Germany formed an alliance, and by 1972 they are Britain's main rival. This alliance is never given an official name, but due to references of this country being extremely influential over Europe, including the former Warsaw Pact nations, I'm surprised DuBois didn't decide to call it the European Community or Union, but whatever. The Franco-German alliance also appears to be the only faction in the world at the moment with a functioning space program. We know they have sent men into space from their launch site at French Guiana and are currently building a space station and plan to try for the moon soon. How exactly the alliance managed all this in 10 years after a nuclear war, I can't say, but maybe they were able to poach most of NASA, since General Curtis probably didn't put funding a space program high on his list of priorities. Also of note is Japan, who has supposedly remilitarized and is expanding their influence in East Asia. They surprisingly don't need to worry about the People's Republic of China, which has fallen apart into several warring states by 1972, for some reason. It's never really explained why this happened in the book. I think perhaps the fallout in Asia was so bad that it just broke down Chinese society, but if China was able to survive Mao's Great Leap Forward, which caused tens of millions of deaths, I think China could survive an atomic war. Korea is also reunited, although it's never explained how or why it happened. Maybe North Korea wasn't able to ride out both the sudden collapse of the communist bloc and the fallout from Russia. The Cuban War also ended America's involvement in Vietnam before it really began, after General Curtis recalled all American forces overseas to return home and assist with reconstruction. By 1963, the country is reunited, although the book describes them as being communist in name only and more than willing to make concessions for trade. Meanwhile, Cuba is governed by Spain, and it's made pretty clear the loss of life there was horrendous. I'm not sure why Spain was given the duty of helping Cuba rather than a closer nation like Mexico, which is implied in the book to be doing okay post-war, but this might just be nitpicking. And that is about it for the world of Resurrection Day. Unfortunately, the book doesn't go into too many details what's going on in places like South America, Africa, or the Middle East, but it does give us some details about the next big crisis. You see, despite Britain's improved standing in the world, it appears that many in Britain fear they are losing ground to the Franco-German alliance and Japan. There have even been skirmishes between Britain and the Franco-Germans at sea, suggesting that another war is brewing. Some members of the British government want to avoid defeat with an audacious plan to not only secure American nuclear weapons, but to bring the United States back into the British Empire by turning their special relationship into something more formal. This is a dumb idea. Ignoring the fact that Britain shouldn't even be in position to do this, how can they possibly think Americans would even accept this? They are already resentful of the British for their arrogant behavior that comes with their aid packages, and now you want to convince them, people who are taught since childhood how their forefathers throughout the tyrant King George, that they should welcome the British back in as rulers? Even if successful, the British would be dealing with a constant rebellion while their rivals force them into an arms race they can't possibly win. So that's the world of Resurrection Day. But again, is it plausible? Well, I did like how realistic the Cuban War was. Instead of creating some Mad Max-esque dystopia, DuBois showed a plausible aftermath of a Cuban Missile Crisis gone hot. Unfortunately, some of his world-building outside of America and Europe didn't make much sense. Countries fell apart or willingly returned to colonialisms without any good reason given. Nevertheless, that doesn't necessarily mean it couldn't happen, but we just weren't given the full picture, because frankly it wasn't relevant to the story. At its heart, Resurrection Day is a story about what happens when America fails to heed Benjamin Franklin's famous warning. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. While we can perhaps understand why Americans were willing to embrace a dictator after the horrors of nuclear war, it cost them everything that made them Americans, leading to a country that was a stunted and twisted version of itself. There is hope, though, as characters take risks to make change possible. Sure, the world of Resurrection Day may not be that plausible, but its story has a message that more people should read. Well, that's what to say on the subject. If you like what I do, please comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.